Okay, we're back, and tonight we're talking about death, everyone's favorite subject. And specifically, we'll be talking a little bit about Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, but what death means to the hero's journey and to art and to storytelling. That's kind of the framework. So we're not talking so much about the psychology of death and dying as we are storytelling aspects of it. Um, So it's been a minute since I've read Ernest Becker's book, um, but he basically makes the case that a lot of human activity boils down to the fact that we're pre-aware of our death. We know we're going to die. We understand our mortality, but we don't understand death itself. It's this complex symbol that we can't make sense of, and so much of our activity is done in the denial of death to distract us from the inevitable, and to just kind of give us some sense of hope or meaning in a world that's been made meaningless by this complex symbol. Um, but he quickly branches out into art and the importance of creativity and um, specifically heroic acts in the face of this certainty. So that's kind of where we're situating this stuff. So, what were some of your initial impressions or whatever of what you've read of the book and things like that?
Well, yeah, pretty much what you said that like Becker thinks that death is so kind of the transcendental signified
Hmm.
that everything is about it. Um, and that everything that we do is a way of trying to deny the denial of death. It's ways that we can deny death, ways that we can escape death. Um, And so what is the artistic way? I guess like the Shakespearean version to like live on in your work, to create something immortal.
Yeah. He talks about another psychologist who talks about artists basically creating their own private religion in their art. And I think that's kind of what he's referring to is I think for us as writers, I think this is particularly important because I think there's a parallel here between this and Milan Kundera's um, terminal paradox. This idea that like the reason we read novels is because they end, and so there's this sense of completeness. Like when you read Don Quixote, you have this sense of like you've lived a full life, and that in the novel's ending is kind of where it finds its significance. And so uh, so many of the stories that we tell now bear some similarity to that because we very popular stories oftentimes deal with apocalyptic events or like the end of things as we know them. Um, but I think to get real personal with it, and where why I feel like this is so important for us to value and valuable for us to contemplate is I think everyone who embarks on the project of telling a story or writing, especially writing a novel, um, you are kind of, whether or not you know it, you're kind of becoming a death obsessed person because you're writing towards some end. You're writing towards some closure. Like you don't just start out. I mean, very few of us. There's maybe a handful of us who start out just writing with the understanding that we're going to write endlessly or something like that. But most people have some intended goal for their writing, and I would say that that goal is standing in for death in some way, shape, or form because it's the thing that signals the closure of the story, the end of the story. Um, so in Don Quixote, it's the character's actual death. In other stories, it's like the hero's return with the gift and things like that. All of these things are symbolize in some way death. Um, so so the act of writing a novel is one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is I think it's kind of a countercultural thing, because we live in a society here in America that is very much obsessed with youth and the beginning of life. But as writers, particularly of novels, we're positioning ourselves to be in this art form that's asking us to constantly consider the end of things, and to work toward the end of things, creatively. Um, yeah. So one question I've got for you is, does that I know this is all theoretical, everything I'm saying right now. This is just a weird hypothesis that I've kind of cooked up recently, and it's inspired by a lot of other stuff. But how does that sit with you? And does it change anything with the way that you do your work?
Well, just listening to what you just said, the first thing that jumped out at me was thinking about kind of the countercultural values that are implicit in the novel. I think they go way beyond just like finding an end of the novel, like
Hmm.
in the medium is the message kind of a way, you know. A novel is a thing that you do alone by yourself, um, in your own head while you're reading. It's a very kind of asocial activity. It's a thing that you do by yourself. Um, if anything, I think the thing that the novel can do that a lot of art forms can't do is really make you kind of meditate on death,
Mm.
because that is also something that you do alone. Ultimately, finally, at the end, you do it alone.
Yeah, I would say that I hear what you're saying about that asocial aspect of reading. There is kind of a communing that happens between the writer and the reader as the novel's kind of made, um, between the writer's writing and the reader's reading. Um, and but what's interesting is like even in that, um, this kind of notion of death kind of creeps in because they're kind of these lonely tasks that are being done across the space of time, you know. You could actually be reading the thoughts of someone who lived before you, you know what I mean? And it you're kind of living out some of what they thought, but you're aware that they've died and moved on. um they're no longer thinking those things. But I think just to press just even further into it, like there is um there is like in the uh in the act of reading, in the act of reading and in the act of writing, there's this kind of like, there is this sense that like something of what I'm trying to say is never going to be fully appreciated or expressible, you know. And that intangible something, I would say, that motivates much of the writing and the reading is this kind of grappling with death.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of like MacGuffins that writers chase, um, one of the holy grails, is to say the thing that cannot be said.
Hmm. Yeah. Some of the things that stand out, just to go back to Becker real briefly, um, is the where he what he says some really interesting stuff about Kierkegaard that I think is well worth the read. But he towards the end he starts talking quite a bit about, uh, the position of psychology and the artist and the heroic individual. So what is the heroic individual? And he talks about how heroism is essentially impossible, um, but that there's in the heroic act there's an expectation to return with a gift, that in the process of becoming a hero you become someone who's there to offer a gift. um, and one of the gifts that Becker believes the hero offers is basically um, this sense of the end um, of the hero himself. So for Becker, that was like he, as a psychologist, basically said that there is an end or there's limits to psychology. And it's heroic of me to say that as a psychologist. Um, so, like another example, maybe in Don Quixote, it would be like if Don Quixote recognized that there was an end or a limit to tilting at windmills. And I'm here to tell you that as someone who has tilted at windmills. Um, and so it's kind of, it may seem like an absurd thing or redundant, but it, I think it behooves us all as we're kind of telling stories to really get down to that nitty gritty thing that makes the hero, and then to recognize the heroic aspects of them abandoning that very thing. Not at the outset, but after it has cost them a tremendous amount. Um, so I can think of numerous examples in popular culture, but the one that probably pops to mind most readily is like the heroic act of like Han Solo, right? Han Solo in Star Wars Episode 4, he's just in it for the money, right? But he gets the money. Like he helps rescue Princess Leia. Um, they come back. He's paid off. He can go pay Jabba and get the bounty off of his head. But for some, so there's that kind of Judas moment where he betrays them, so to speak, and goes off to do his own thing. But then, of course, he appears, and he's the one who actually knocks Darth Vader out of the sky with the Millennium Falcon. So he's come to the end of this heroic posture of himself as as the space scavenger, rascal or whatever. Um, he's decided the money wasn't worth it, wasn't worth what he thought it was. He would much rather go and help these people who are in this impossible situation. Um, I think there's other examples, but it's one of those things that's like behooves us as writers, particularly as we're thinking about the end game, as we're thinking about wrapping up a project. What is that thing that our hero needs to give up, that is of their very heroicness? Um, and I think there's a similar challenge to us personally. I don't think this is just something that happens on the page. I think these are things that translate to our real lives.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of want to point out that you're focusing on like one sense of endness.
Mm,
So we can say, like, there is an end, like, there's an end of tilting at windmills in the sense that there will come a time when no one tilts at windmills ever again.
mm,
That's not what you're talking about right now. There's also a time where there's also a sense where it is there's a time for tilting at windmills,
mm,
and then that time ends and it's time for us to like develop and move on to other things. What comes after tilting windmills?
mm,
Something else comes after that. I don't think that is even what you're talking about. You're talking, and argue with me if you think I have it wrong, but the end that you're focusing on is I will tilt at windmills because I think tilting at windmills is a worthwhile thing for me to do. And at a certain point, I become disillusioned with that. And I don't believe that tilting at windmills is a worthwhile thing to do anymore. And I'm kind of left in the aftermath of that.
No, the only thing I would put, I think you've done a good job of encapsulating various ways that we can talk about ends. Um, but I am not speaking about like a heroic disillusionment. The way that Becker frames it is it is itself still a heroic act. So I don't think disillusionment would be under the category of heroic act. It is part of what the hero has to experience. They do have to experience disillusionment, but this is something that comes beyond that. And the way that Becker talks about it is it's really interesting. It gets really twisty and turny, but he basically makes a case as a psychologist, as an agnostic. Towards the end of his book, he makes a case for religion, which is about as anti-Freudian as you can get. But his case for religion is this: is even if it's a lie, it is heroic to believe this lie because it leads us to heroic virtues. Um, and so that's what I said. It's really twisty turning. So there's the initial sense of disillusionment with a religion, but then there's this capitulation with it as well. This kind of surrendering of the heroic posture against religion as a psychologist, and adopting religious practice and religious faith because Becker believed it is the only thing that could allow him to develop the character qualities that he felt like were of worth to him and of worth to others. Um, so it's does that make sense? It is
Yeah.
it's a one step beyond disillusionment.
Yeah. So, okay. So then the thing that we need to do is take that and make what we do an analogy for it.
Hmm.
So do you think it stands? Do you think it holds? I have become disillusioned with writing novels. I don't think that it means what I thought it meant 20 years ago. I don't think it's going to do what I thought it was going to do, but it's still worth doing because the things that it teaches me to do are good things to be. Help me create that analogy. Help me translate it
Yeah,
across.
I think you're getting. I mean, you're definitely driving in the right direction. So yeah, that's it for me as a writer. When I started out 20 years ago, I had a lot of idealistic notions about what this thing was going to be, and yeah, I'm sure you share that, right?
I do so yeah. I had idealistic notions, but I think most of the people that I knew had commercial notions.
Yeah, yeah. There's those two, which I think all of that creeps in because I think in America it's really unavoidable for art at some place to become a business venture as well. Um, so then there's a lot of rejection. That's kind of act two of the writer's journey is rejection, failure, all of those. You meet mentors along the way. You meet companions like you and I feel like are close companions on this journey. Um, but then there comes this moment of like you're saying disillusionment where you realize, oh, even if I do the darndest, like even if I destroy the Death Star, so to speak, um it didn't really change very much. Like it didn't really do much of what I thought it was going to do. It accomplished something, but it was not at all what I was promised, I don't feel. Um, and Becker is saying you recognize that you were sold a bill of goods. You know what I mean? Like you recognize that this writing life is a lie. That there is some not just fiction, but it is itself a bill of goods. Um, and you continue to do it knowing that. And that is in essence kind of the Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's a psychology of faith that's one's cultivating at that point. Um, in that you continue, it's kind of like what Samuel Beckett was driving at when he said, I can't go on, I'll go on. It is an existential decision that in the face of this absurdity, I'll take the consequences of continuing to do this seemingly absurd thing um, because that has moral value. Um,
I think the question in that is how, give me a second.
mm,
How much is my I can't go on, I will go on that I see a value in it anyway? And how much of it is what else am I going to do?
yeah. Yeah, I think there's something of that. I mean, Becker really leaves it there. And I don't um I don't necessarily agree with Becker leaving it there. I think that in a purely existential, purely empirical, materialistic sense, it's right to just leave it there. But that's basically living into a divorce between the material and spiritual. Just saying that there's nothing spiritual about existence, and any attempts at spiritualizing things at this point is, you know, not helpful, or uh, overly simplifying things, or really kind of untrue to the human experience. Um, I kind of position myself separate from that. I do think that there is a spiritual actualization that can happen around here, um, where where God, so to speak, steps in, and we realize there's not just empirical notions in play. There's other things that have agencies of their own that are in play. So, get like Becker would say, the leap of faith is basically valuable in and of itself as an existential moral decision with consequences. Kierkegaard
But
was
it's a
actually,
noble lie. But it's a
yeah,
noble
it's
lie.
a noble lie, and that's exactly what he calls it towards the end of the book.
Hmm.
Kierkegaard would actually say, no, this is a spiritual thing. This is spiritual. It's existential, but it's also spiritual. Um, so I think it is interesting, because I think the majority of so where are we at right now in terms of our culture, and what do our novels do? Um, and what do the story, not just novels, but what do the kinds of stories that we tell do? I would say most of our stories are situated more along the lines that Becker's exploring, of like, there's nothing new under the sun, that kind of under the sun kind of framework of, kind of empirically measurable existence.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really, really valid thing. I think some of the best books that I've read, though, suggest that there's a possibility of other interpretations. And it can be very subtle in the way that it's handled. I don't think we have to bludgeon readers with the suggestion of spiritual things, or, you know what I mean, come right out and say it or anything like that. But some of my favorite books have ended more with that sense of suggestion that there is more that meets the eye, occurring.
Well, your blend, and maybe this is itself is like an important thing to do. But your blend, you're conflating a little bit
Mhm.
the reason that we write and what is what do we write?
Mhm. Yeah, that's something I constantly am struggling with. But for me personally, I'm not interested in writing the types of books that are just, well written, um, explorations of the mundane. Or
Yeah,
that I'm not, as much as I like reading, um, the poetry of Ammons, or, oh, just stories that are basically about the complexities of a kitchen sink or something like that. Um,
yeah.
I It's not necessarily what I have no desire to write those things. I guess I'm a little bit of a medievalist. Like, I'm trying to get back to the place where literature served an ultimately spiritual end. Um,
Yeah, me too. I think maybe the difference between us a little bit is I don't think that they can be separated. Like I think they
mm,
do. We just we just don't like the spirituality that they express right now.
mm, that's interesting. I
It's
haven't
not
thought
that they
about
like
that.
don't do it. They do it and they do a shitty job of it.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, it's one of those things that it became very interesting to me, especially as NaNoWriMo was coming to an end, is that this is very much about from the very beginning writing something that has an ending, and like writing very much with an end in sight, the end of November. And I
Mm.
wonder how many people actually step back from this undertaking and say, this signifies my death. Everything that I'm doing right now is an activity. I'm doing it in the denial of death, but it signifies so blatantly an exploration of mortality. Um,
And part of that problem, even as you kind of work through the phases of a piece,
mm,
the end game kind of like has completely different rules
yes.
than the game. Like the end game, the rules flip. And I think for us, death is like that too. Like if you told me I was going to die in a month, I would probably stop writing. I probably wouldn't write anymore because I would want to spend those last 2 months with my wife and my son, talking to my friends. Like that's what I would want to spend my like. It's really the end game time with, you know. But you can't live a life constantly being ready to die.
Mm. Yeah, I don't think I
If you
agree.
if you if you live that way, then all you're spending your entire life saying goodbye to a thing that you haven't even done yet.
Yeah, you're basically not existing. Yeah, Becker talks about that. I think the challenge is more not to live like a death obsessed life or someone who's constantly fearing death or constantly prepared for death. It's just, in essence, kind of like the idea of living backwards, like living with the understanding that someday I will die, with the like with the memento mori on the desk. And how does that change the undertakings that I have for today?
How
Um,
does it? It's an open question because that's basically what I just talked about. Like I don't know how to wrap my head around that. To
yeah.
me, I would stop writing because I'm like, right, like I'm gonna die. So start getting ready to leave. Like say goodbye. It's a different mode than I'm in the middle, you know.
Hmm.
If I'm supposed to live with the knowledge that I'm going to die constantly in mind, I'm struggling to get the value out of that I think Becker wants us to get out of it. Because in my head, I just go right to its end game. I'm in the penultimate chapter. That goes very different than like a middle chapter. It's one thing to know that you're going to die, it's another thing to be at the end. And I can't tell how he means for us to separate those two states, which we clearly have to do. I mean, if he says we don't, then he's just a fool.
Hmm.
We clearly have to separate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you've identified a significant, like problem or complexity of this uh book and what Becker's talking about. Um, and I do think maybe that is it very well be that the complexity that you're talking about is the kind of chispa de vida, you know what I mean? It is kind of the spark of life. That is um speaking to some ultimate thing. Um, yeah. But I mean, also part of what you're saying is that when we get to this point in the conversation, we really are kind of allowing ourselves as individuals, but also as friends, as people who are connected and care about each other, to grapple with this symbol out in the open, and to say I can't make sense of it. I'm not making sense of it. And I think that's valuable. I think that's deeply valuable. Like it's one of those things I want to acknowledge in storytelling. I want to acknowledge in friendships. It's not always a comfortable thing, you know what I mean? But I think it has an inherent meaning in people coming together and say, yeah, we can't make sense of this thing.
Yeah. I mean, the only other kind of big idea that Becker gave me, especially when I think of Becker like in relationship with what we do. Like in the hero journey sense, the death
Mm,
of the hero, it constitutes a sacrifice. Like the
right.
hero's death matters because the hero sacrifices himself. He doesn't just get old and die.
Yeah.
When he died, like I don't, not every hero needs to like die in the story, but the hero has to make a sacrifice. And the kind of easy way in a story to show that is the hero dies. He makes the ultimate sacrifice. But I think the point that we miss a lot is that that sacrifice was made for something, you know? So
Yeah.
I guess maybe for us, it would be like maybe to answer my own question and to tie that back to Becker, it's that you should live so that when you die, when death comes, without your foreknowledge, it caught you in the act of sacrifice to the thing that was greater than you.
Yeah. Becker talks about it. I'm looking at his little chapter on the heroic individual, and he kind of continues the conversation about Kierkegaard. And I think this is really driving at it. He talks about the knight of faith, knight, uh, Knight.
Okay.
Um, but he says this is a figure of the man, or I guess it could be the woman, who lives faith, who has who has given over the meaning of his life to his creator, and who lives centered on the energies of his maker. He accepts whatever happens in this viable, visible dimension without complaint. He lives his life as a duty, faces his death without qualm. So I think the idea that's significant for us as artists is it's kind of what I think there's overlap here with Borges and this idea of like a collective unconsciousness, or I mean, frankly, with Kierkegaard and this notion of a creator, that in the act of writing, I am kind of lowercase c quotation mark creating, right? Um, but there is a creator who empowers me and directs my energies as a writer, a capital C creator who actually created this instance in which lowercase c I am creating. Um, and that the deeper I go into this writing thing, even though it seems absurd and it seems ultimately meaningless, the more attuned I am with the energies of my own maker.
Yeah, that okay. I so that sounds good to me. What I'm wondering out of that is the big C creator that created the small C creator. Is that your telos? Were you created to create?
Telos, remind me what that means. I'm not a good Christian.
Your purpose.
Okay. I think about, yeah, telos or logos, right? What is my
Telos is
word?
like, what are you for?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of this thing?
Yeah. I would say it all finds its answer. This is going to sound really reductive, but it all finds its answer in the creator. Yes, my purpose finds its answer in not my own creation or the things that I create, but in my own creation that I am myself created.
Created not by you.
Correct. Yeah. So because if the end of art is to render up this great creation thing that I made, right? Because I made it and I'm so unique and special and I make these unique and special things, that is absurd, right? No one will remember me in 50 years. No one will care. Even Shakespeare's dream of immortality through writing is completely absurd, right? Um, and so,
Ultimately, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when the sun blows up, who cares? But
Yeah,
like,
when the heat death of the universe happens and entropy
right,
takes hold, not a
yeah,
lot of not a lot of poetry going to be read.
Yeah, so just check that notion at the door, Shakespeare. It doesn't survive the nuclear winter, even, of our planet. So I think that, as much as I love Shakespeare, don't get me wrong, but I think the transition is like, I'm going to create this unique and precious and beautiful thing because I'm uniquely created. It's a totally different perspective. I'm engaging in creativity as a creature, as a creation. And an aspect of what I was created to do is to create in turn. Um, so my purpose doesn't find itself in whether or not people remember me, or you remember my uniqueness. Um, Calvin said it like, we are actors on the stage and the audience is God, you know.
But okay, but the manifestation or the mode, does it matter or is it arbitrary?
I think it
Like
matters. I
you
do
could
think
be
it matters.
creating as like a, you could be a carpenter, you could be an electrician, you could be, but you write books.
And it's like Buckminster Fuller kind of argued that everyone's a genius, but not everyone discovers what their genius is. I believe that's true. I really do.
That's part of
Some
what I'm asking when I say that. Like, did the
mm,
creator create you to create books?
To the best that
Or
I
he
can
created
discern
you
at
to
this time.
create, and you're just like finding ways to what to do with that nervous energy that I need to create.
I lean more towards the second, in all honesty, because I think books is an arbitrary value. You know what I mean? Like literature, I would say, is an arbitrary value. It's something that society calls literature, but I have no clue what society means by that. We all have different definitions for what it is. So the idea that I just create literature is kind of silly too. But I think it is more just like you find these places, and it's like you sing and the universe kind of sings back at you. Um,
Yeah.
um, well, that's all.
I think you explained that well. I think you explained that well.
Good. I'm glad it's not totally. I mean, it feels like we're kind of out in the weeds, but this is close to my heart. I feel like the creative endeavor, you know what I mean, properly understood. Um, I think we have to wrestle with this. And I'm not saying everyone needs to agree with me, this idea that, we are created and that's what gives meaning to our creator, our creations. But but I do think each one of us needs to wrestle with this because it is part of the art. Like I think it's baked into literature or baked into notions of storytelling. Um, yeah. Well,
Yeah, I do too.
and frankly, I mean, it's baked into the show. So one thing that I mean, as we kind of have been meeting and talking about all this stuff, it's one thing that I think we have to like bear in mind is like what is the end for this? Like what does this mean and what does it signify? Otherwise, it just becomes purposeless. You know what I mean? We're just meeting just for the sake of meeting. Um,
Yeah,
so there's challenges here, but there's also, I think, a real sense of like potential. The only other thing I want to add to this, because I feel like it's a significant and it came up recently. I worked recently with a director on a script, and the script wound up being overwritten. Like if we created the movie based on the script, it would be over 120 minutes long.
mm,
And that's not kind of the kind of movie it needs to be. And so he just texted me about killing babies. You've probably heard that term before, like go out and kill
yeah,
your lovelies or kill the babies, the ones you care about the most.
your
Um,
darlings.
your darlings, yes. Um, that process of killing the things that are nearest and dearest to you in a storytelling project is really, really important. And if you skip over it, I don't. I think you're gonna miss something. Um,
We know how to handle it is you don't kill them. You just cut and paste them into a new document. You say, I'm going to use this for something else. Like,
Okay, that's one school, and I do that. I have what's called the boneyard, where stuff goes in the boneyard.
the
But I
thing
think
is, I have gone to it enough and like found things and was like, this is brilliant and it's going to work really well in this completely different project that like I get the dopamine hits out of that enough to like keep doing it.
that's encouraging. I think you're a good advocate for that aspect of the method of baby killing. Um, we need to come up with a better term for this, but like the other thing that happens is kind of like Einsteinian. It's like this theory of relativity thing where like the matter of the story releases energy when it's destroyed. Um, so it's kind of like splitting atoms, I think. When we kill these elements of the story that we think are important, tremendous amounts of energy is released for the reader. Um, like I recently was working with a writer who's coming along, and he'd written a chapter where two of the characters went grocery shopping, and I made the case like this whole chapter needs to be cut, like the entire chapter needs to be cut. We don't need to see them go grocery shopping. You can just tell us what they got. And when you read it that way, when you read it without the grocery shop chapter, tremendous energy is released because like the reader loves those kinds of jumps where things jumped forward, and they trust the writer because they skipped over the parts you don't need to know, where nothing much happened. Um, so I do want to make that case for like when we do this, we're doing it with intention, and we're doing it with the understanding that the reader appreciates it. It creates an energy around the story. When those elisions, those absences speak. Um, so yeah, practical stuff. Well, man, have a good rest of your night.
Yeah, you too.
I'll see you Thursday, Lord
Thursday.
willing. And yeah, the creek don't dry. See you, man.
Yep.